Hey guys, tonight we wander through the glittering salons of pre-revolutionary France, where the chandeliers drip with candlelight, the cakes are taller than toddlers, and poodles sit on velvet cushions with more poise than most nobles. You're standing, well, politely wobbling, at the entrance to a marbled drawing room in Versailles, and in front of you, a poodle. Not just any poodle. This one's fur has been powdered and curled into heart-shaped poofs, its ears are tied with satin bows, and it's wearing a ruffled waistcoat so chic you briefly wonder if it's haute couture. It tilts its head at you, knowingly. To your left, a countess in a wig the size of a hat stand whispers baby French to her fluffy companion, who blinks slowly, as if deeply unimpressed. Behind her, a footman wheels in a gold-plated cart with precisely portioned pâté, some for humans, most for dogs. You're in the weird, wafting epicenter of one of history's most oddly enchanting footnotes, when French aristocrats trained their poodles to be the toast of tea parties. And yes, you probably won't survive this, not emotionally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you under a blanket? Sitting on a fire escape? Hiding from real life behind a scented candle? I want to know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't walk into the 18th century. You glide. That's the rule. Versailles isn't built for stomping or even confident striding. Too many fragile inlays, too many rooms that feel like the inside of a Fabergé egg. As you pass through the long gallery, paintings of powdered nobles peer down, their eyes slightly judgmental. But none judge harder than the dogs. In this golden age of powdered elegance and outrageous hats, poodles are not mere pets. They're status symbols. In some cases, they're closer to lifestyle brands. The white miniature at the Duchess's slippered feet is known by name to at least 3 foreign ambassadors. The standard-sized black one being spritzed with bergamot. He once spoke on stage at a salon gathering by barking at a painting of Voltaire. Historians still argue whether French poodles of this era were genuinely more intelligent than other breeds, or simply had the leisure time and foie gras budget to seem smarter. Either way, it was the French aristocracy who gave them the ultimate glow-up. Now imagine this. The year is 1761. The air in Versailles smells of violets, warm bread, and something faintly burnt, probably a wig. A new trend is sweeping through the court. Not fashion this time, but performance. Not by humans, though. It's called La Demonstration Canine. You squint at a poster. A duchess is hosting an evening of tea and talent, and the headliner? A poodle named Monsieur Beignet, known for bowing with his left paw and identifying which wine pairs best with Comté cheese. You think, okay, surely that's a one-off. But it's not. These dog-centric soirees are everywhere. A marquise trains her toy poodle to mimic her husband's cough. A duke teaches his 2 spaniels to play dead every time someone mentions taxes. It's become a thing. You glance into the courtyard. There, on a miniature chaise lounge, a caramel-colored poodle sits serenely, as a servant delicately brushes its tail into a spiral. The brush is made from imported badger hair and costs more than your shoes. Beneath the opulence, though, is a kind of method. These dogs aren't just props. They're trained, rehearsed, socialized with the precision of diplomats. They must not bark at the wrong moment. They must never, never steal a scone. In one corner of the salon, you see a little chalkboard with today's dog menu, duck broth, parsnip tartlets, and a coconut milk glaze. Someone has drawn a bone in pink chalk next to the word dessert. And this isn't the exception. This is how things are. Fun fact, some of these poodles had custom shoes made for them, not for walking comfort, but to prevent the parquet floors from being scratched. We're talking satin booties with little mother-of-pearl buttons. You bend down to look at one, and the poodle huffs like it's very aware it's more important than you. Here's the real kicker. Aristocrats didn't just dress their dogs like nobles. They believed the poodles embodied virtues like loyalty, refinement, and wit. And naturally, the more impressive your dog, the more impressive you were. One noblewoman, the Comtesse de Flore, was so obsessed with her poodle's grace that she commissioned a portrait just of the dog riding in a gondola. She claimed it soothed her anxiety better than prayer. That painting now lives in a dusty museum storage vault, forgotten by most, but not by us tonight. And if you're thinking, okay, this sounds excessive, let me assure you, the excess hasn't even started yet. You're still in the parlor. You haven't even reached the private training salons, or the etiquette schools, or the scandalous biscuit incident of 1764. But we'll get there. For now, just listen. A harpist starts playing near the window, and the soft trill of strings floats through the air like spun sugar. A few dogs yawn politely. One licks a spoon clean and nods, as if approving the vanilla. You realize something odd. Almost no one here is actually talking to other people. Every conversation is with a dog. One marquis adjusts his lapel and says, "Pierre, shall we tell them your poetry?" And the dog barks twice. Everyone claps. A footman leans over to whisper in your ear. He only barks for rhyming couplets. Right. Naturally. You recline on a love seat draped in embroidered silk. You sip tea that tastes faintly of jasmine and judgment. And as your eyes wander across the room of poodles and pearls, you ask yourself the one question that's probably never occurred to you before tonight. How exactly does one teach a poodle to behave at a tea party? Don't worry, we're just getting started. You stretch your legs slightly beneath the silk-draped love seat, careful not to disturb the tassels, or the small dog snoozing under your heel like it owns the deed to the chateau. Around you, the room hums with a peculiar energy. Not the energy of politics or romance, which usually drives the chatter in Versailles, but of fierce, toothy competition. Because tonight, the poodles are preening. The duchesses? Watching. And somewhere across the salon, someone is about to win the Concours de Beauté Canine, the poodle pageant. Yes, that's right. The powdered people of 18th century France didn't just dress up their dogs for private amusement. They put them on literal stages. Now you're probably imagining a runway with lights and glitter, but that would be far too subtle. This one involves floral arches, harpsichord interludes, and a scorecard system that would give the Olympic Committee an anxiety attack. You squint at a score sheet tucked behind a teacup. Fluffiness of tail, 10 points. Consistency of coat color, 10 points. Ability to maintain eye contact with a marquise for 5 seconds without blinking, 15 points. Does not chase pastries, automatic qualification. The doors swing open dramatically. A white poodle struts in, coiffed to perfection, fur fluffed into curls like whipped meringue, each paw adorned with a tiny silk ribbon. A gasp ripples through the salon. Someone drops a spoon. "That's Choo-Choo," whispers a young gentleman beside you. She once held a 20-second pose with a macaroon on her head. Now that's talent. Here's where it gets weird. Well, weirder. Historians still argue whether these canine beauty pageants were organized purely for status or secretly served as coded displays of court alliances. One scholar even suggests that a duchess's dog's performance could swing influence in minor political disputes. That's right. A perfect paw wave from a poodle might decide whether a cousin gets appointed to a sinecure in Provence. You stare at Choo-Choo again, wondering if you're witnessing something much more sinister in all this fluff. A trumpet blares softly. Well, as softly as a trumpet can. The next contestant enters. This one's dyed faintly lavender. Yes, dyed. Back then, it wasn't uncommon to tint a dog's fur using crushed petals or mineral pigments. Lavender for serenity, pale blue for poise, and once, famously, crimson for revenge. But that's a story for another section. There's a ripple of murmuring as judges approach. 3 elderly nobles, each with opera glasses, peer down their powdered noses to inspect the contestants' tails. One dog curtsies. Yes, curtsies. Now let's take a second to appreciate the human effort behind all this. These looks don't happen by accident. Poodles of the era had their own grooming teams. That's right. Not just a single handler or a bored valet. A team. One servant shampooed with rose water and goat's milk. Another curled the fur with heated ivory rods. A third powdered the ears, yes, powdered, with starch-based scents to match the master's chosen fragrance for the evening. And the outfits? Embroidered silks, tiny lace vests, pearl-threaded collars, even miniature slippers lined with ermine. One document from 1770 details a poodle outfit that cost more than a servant's yearly wage. Just one outfit. You glance at a tall mirror and see your own reflection next to a dog in a cravat. Guess who looks more important? But all of this grooming and preening had a darker flip side. At court, beauty was a weapon, and so, naturally, it became one for the dogs, too. Scandalous whisper. A viscountess once paid a rogue groomer to accidentally snip off another dog's signature ear curl. Gasps were gasped, gloves were slapped, and for 3 whole weeks, no one in court touched elderflower biscuits out of sheer protest. You sip your tea quietly, then something catches your attention. A miniature black poodle, barely the size of a hatbox, is led in with a flourish. It's wearing a cape. Not just any cape, a hand-stitched replica of the king's coronation robe, complete with gold thread and a tiny fleur-de-lis. The judges visibly swoon. Someone behind you murmurs, "He's called Le Petit Soleil." Of course he is. Now don't get the idea that every poodle was a willing participant. Oh no, there were rebels. Poodles who refused to bow. Poodles who barked at duchesses. One particularly legendary case involves a standard poodle named Marat who, during a pageant finale, leapt onto the refreshment table and devoured 3 pigeon pastries before being tackled by a footman. He wasn't disqualified. He was famous. They wrote a sonnet about him. And that, my friend, is when you realize this is more than vanity. It's theater. It's high drama. It's a carefully choreographed act in a society built on appearances and illusion. Remember, Versailles isn't just about power. It's about the performance of power. And now, dogs are part of the show. As the last contestant exits the stage, a gray poodle with a monocle, you feel the tension lift. A butler clears his throat. The judges will now deliberate, he announces. Everyone claps politely. The dogs bow, some with assistance. Servants wheel out trays of chilled melon balls, for the Poodles, obviously, and the salon melts back into lazy murmurs and perfume clouds. You lean back again, watching a poodle delicately sip from a crystal dish of elderflower water. And you start to wonder, if this is how they dress their pets, how on earth do they train them to behave? What's the secret? Bribes? Hypnosis? Elaborate interpretive dance? Oh, you're going to find out. But first, you'll need to meet the manners tutors. The melon balls are gone. The monocled poodle is now curled on a silk cushion, dreaming of accolades or roast duck, or both. And you're slipping quietly into a side corridor, trailing a small group of nobles murmuring something about la classe de courtoisie canine. That's right. Welcome to etiquette school. But not for you, of course, for the dogs. You peer through a crack in a gilded door and blink. It's a classroom. An actual classroom, with velvet floor cushions, low tables, and just one, very serious-looking elderly gentleman with a thin mustache and a pointer stick. At his feet, 7 perfectly groomed poodles. One is wearing a ruffled collar and squinting in concentration. Another is attempting to balance a grape on its nose. A third, a stately black poodle with an impressive pompadour, is being scolded for turning its back during a mock curtsy. This is Monsieur Delacroix, a canine comportment expert. Basically, he teaches dogs how not to embarrass the aristocracy in front of important guests. He taps his stick twice. All the dogs sit. A third tap, 2 bow. One sneezes. Delacroix narrows his eyes but says nothing. Clearly, sneezing isn't in the curriculum. You're witnessing a real phenomenon. Because yes, there really were manuals, actual written etiquette guides, crafted specifically for noble pets. Fragments of them still exist in dusty archives, on the proper angle of the paw, when greeting a viscount. How to decline a grape politely without causing alarm. Mouthing without gnawing. The lost art of graceful fetch. Historians still argue whether these books were earnest training tools or elaborate jokes that spiraled out of control. But one thing's for sure. Nobles treated canine manners with the same gravitas as human ones, which is saying something, considering half the humans here still don't know which fork to use. You step quietly into the room as Delacroix continues. He's demonstrating the napkin drape, how a dog should politely receive a linen cloth on its shoulders without wriggling, whining, or looking personally insulted. Presentation is respect, he says to the class, but also, clearly, to you. One student, a poodle named Duchesse, flops over dramatically mid-lesson. "Non," says Delacroix, without turning. "That is drama, not discipline." The others freeze. Duchesse sighs. Outside this room, nobles discuss war, taxes, and lace. But here, it's about silence, stillness, and the perfect head tilt. Delacroix moves to a different corner of the room and claps his hands. A servant enters with a silver tray of biscuits, lavender, honey, and something called pheasant crumble. This is the final exam. Each poodle must resist, must not reach, not even sniff, not even blink longingly. You hold your breath as the tray passes by. One dog's whiskers twitch. Another lets out the smallest whine. Then, bam! A tiny white poodle named Bijou lunges. One crumb disappears. Delacroix sighs. The tray is whisked away. Bijou is gently escorted to the room of reflection, which, judging by the sound of distant harp music, is actually more luxurious than your entire apartment. Still, a lesson is a lesson. The other dogs resume position. Now comes the most advanced drill, simulated social hour. Servants bring in miniature tea tables, complete with tiny cups, napkins, and porcelain saucers. Delacroix walks each dog through the steps. Sit calmly, sniff the cup, without tipping it, allow a servant to pour invisible tea, and hold position for 10 seconds. You whisper to yourself, "This is madness." But is it? In a world where human identity is built on etiquette, reputation, and appearances, it only makes sense that one's dog must also know how to play the part. And these dogs are not just playing, they're performing a kind of balletic obedience. You can't help but admire it. Some say these schools began as a joke, perhaps a bored noble poking fun at his peers. Others believe they started in earnest, part of the larger movement to civilize every part of life, from forks to footsteps. But no matter how they began, they became part of the court machinery. A well-trained dog reflected a well-ordered household. A poodle that could sit still through a salon debate about Voltaire was a social asset, just like a flattering portrait or a particularly witty turn of phrase. Here's a deliciously odd detail. Some nobles even loaned their best-trained poodles to friends hosting important guests. Think of it as renting prestige, like borrowing a yacht today, only fluffier. As the class winds down, Delacroix dismisses the poodles with a flourish. Each dog glides, out the door, their tails held high, their expressions serene. And just like that, you've seen it. The quiet, disciplined engine behind the powdered spectacle. Not just pretty fluff balls and lace, but rigorously trained ambassadors of aristocratic identity. You step back into the corridor, and for a moment, the palace feels different, less frivolous, more theatrical. Because once you know the lines of the script, you start seeing the stage everywhere. But don't get too comfortable yet. The dogs may be polite, but they're also fluent. And in the next room, they're about to out-talk the butlers. You barely have time to process the mental image of a poodle bowing in slow motion before the next sound reaches your ears. It's not barking, not really. It's conversation, sort of. From a distance, it sounds like a cross between polite murmurs, tiny yelps, and the delicate tinkling of porcelain. You follow the sound down a winding hallway past yet more brocade curtains and candle-lit sconces until you reach a circular room filled with voices, both human and, astonishingly, canine. Welcome to the language salon. Here, nestled among scrollwork paneling and velvet cushions, aristocrats sit in small groups with their poodles, speaking to them in court French. Yes, court French. Because you see, in Versailles, it wasn't enough for a dog to respond to sit or stay. It had to do so in the language of diplomacy. And not just any French, precisely enunciated, occasionally rhymed, and always performed in a tone just shy of flirtatious condescension. Assieds-toi, mon trésor, coos a marquise, and her dog obediently sits, eyes fluttering closed as if meditating on Rousseau. Another nobleman lifts a gloved hand. Fais la révérence. His poodle gently bends a front leg and lowers its chin. You blink. Surely this is all trained behavior, not actual comprehension. But then someone claps twice and says, Va chercher la broche. And a poodle bolts across the room, grabs a jeweled hairpin from a low stool, and delivers it proudly into the folds of a duchess's skirt. Now you're not so sure. Modern behaviorists would say these are simply cue-based tricks, driven by repetition and treats. But 18th century aristocrats didn't believe in simple things. They believed in symbolism, in artistry, in the blurring of lines between pet and person. And here's the thing. Some of these dogs were better trained than the palace footmen. There's a record of a particularly talented poodle named Emile, who could recognize over 40 spoken commands, including walk softly, look indifferent, and feign interest. Historians still argue whether the commands were real or simply part of a larger aristocratic fantasy about control. But the results speak for themselves. These weren't household pets. They were conversational companions. Now, let's talk incentives. Because language learning, even for dogs, doesn't come cheap, or without snacks. In one plush corner of the room, you spot a vocabulary trainer dangling a small slice of goose pâté in front of a chocolate-brown poodle. Répète, coucou, he whispers, as the dog mimics a small bark shaped vaguely like a question mark. Another aristocrat uses a series of gestures alongside her commands. Left hand raised equals approach. 2 fingers twitched equals bow. A single wink. Retrieve the fan without disturbing the corset pile. Yes, there's a corset pile. That's just Versailles. And don't think for a second this was limited to verbal commands. Some nobles claimed their poodles could read. You're not sure whether to laugh or faint. But one elaborate story involves a dog named Gaston, who was trained to tap his paw on printed cue cards. His owner would lay out cards with simple French words, gâteau, chaise, chasse, and Gaston would trot forward, tap the correct one, and then politely wait for applause. Whether Gaston was truly reading or simply had an excellent nose for duck-scented paper remains a point of heated academic debate. One scholar argued that dogs of Versailles could be considered early members of the salon culture. Not contributors, perhaps, but performers who reinforced the ideals of wit, grace, and control. And then there's this gem. Some poodles were trained to respond to poetry. You hear it for yourself. An elderly baron recites, Le vent danse sur l'eau, léger comme toi. His poodle sighs, bows deeply, and then lies down with an elegant groan. The entire room claps. Someone mutters, he prefers Baudelaire. You don't ask. You just nod. Of course he does. Even more surreal? These performances weren't just private entertainment. They were public status flexes. Noble families would host evening salons where invited guests would witness the conversation skills of their dogs, often as a warm-up act before a harpsichord duet or a mildly scandalous puppet play. And woe to the family whose poodle forgot its syntax. One infamous incident involved a poodle named Chiffon, who, instead of barking twice for wee, let out a very impolite snort. His owner, a viscountess, was so humiliated she reportedly left the room and refused to speak to her dog for an entire month. The dog, incidentally, spent that month lounging in a powder-pink chaise, licking sugar cubes and being read excerpts from the social contract. You start to get the feeling that no one here, not even the dogs, is really living in reality anymore. But it's lovely, isn't it? This velvet-draped illusion where dogs speak French. Poetry makes sense. And even a sideways tail wag can be a subtle form of court flattery. Before you leave the room, you catch a final glimpse of a tutor slowly flipping through a book of idiomatic expressions for poodles. Il pleut des croquettes, she jokes. It's raining kibble. The dog barks approvingly. You laugh softly to yourself. You weren't sure you could be surprised again. And then someone says, "Ready for charades?" Because yes, the next room, it's all games. You follow the sound of laughter, real human laughter this time, mingled with excited yaps and the unmistakable clatter of dice on marble. The corridor opens into a high-ceilinged room where the candles burn a little brighter and the poodles move with flair. You've entered the Salon de Jeux Canin, the canine games salon. The walls are lined with pastel murals of dogs playing cards, dogs juggling apples, dogs fencing with toothpicks. A bit on the nose, perhaps, but nothing in Versailles is ever subtle. At the center of the room, noblemen and noblewomen cluster around what looks like a small stage. There's music playing, light harpsichord, a bit of flute, and in the spotlight stands a poodle in a powdered wig, wearing tiny spectacles and a velvet waistcoat. He's balancing on his hind legs. In one paw, a small scroll. In the other, wait, is that a cane? The nobleman beside you leans over and whispers reverently, "That's Voltaire." You glance back at the dog. "I beg your pardon?" "The role he's playing," the man clarifies. "Voltaire, in the charades." Of course, dog charades. Apparently, you've arrived just in time for the Guess the Philosopher round. A duchess waves a fan. Is it Diderot? The poodle dramatically shakes its head and slams the cane to the floor. "Ah!" gasps someone. "He's angry. That's a satire." More guesses follow. Eventually, a marquise guesses correctly. "Voltaire during the Rousseau debate." The room erupts in applause. The dog bows deeply. Treats rain from the ceiling. Literal treats from a hidden chute. Because of course they do. Now, if you think this is just mindless fun, think again. These salon games were strategic social tools. Dogs weren't just amusing guests. They were active participants in carefully crafted displays of intellect and grace. Historians still argue whether this trend started as a parody of Enlightenment pretensions or as a genuine attempt to elevate pet training to an art form. But the result was the same. High society found a new way to perform, and perform through their poodles. A bell chimes. It's time for the next event. Culinary charades. You watch as a noblewoman kneels beside her fluffy white poodle and whispers a command. The dog trots to a tray, sniffs 3 items, cheese, pear, and cinnamon, and then uses its paw to knock over the cinnamon. "Aha!" the woman exclaims. "Pommes de cannelle, the dessert we had last night." Cue laughter, applause, and more airborne treats. There's a game where dogs retrieve costume pieces related to historical figures. There's another where they mimic human emotions. One very serious-looking black poodle named Figaro performs a sulky teenage slouch so accurate you feel personally attacked. And then comes the crowd favorite, tableau vivant. Here, poodles are dressed and posed to recreate famous paintings. Tonight's theme? Scenes from the life of Marie Antoinette. The first tableau features 3 poodles, one in a tiara, one with a wig full of fake fruit, and one pretending to faint while draped over a miniature chaise. A card beside them reads, "When the pastry cart arrived late." Modern scholars debate how much of this was spectacle and how much was a subtle critique of court life. Was this performance or parody? Were the dogs complicit or just well-fed actors? You're not sure, but you are sure you've never seen a poodle wear a miniature tricorn hat quite so convincingly. As the evening continues, games grow more elaborate. You witness a reenactment of the founding of Rome, with dogs playing both Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf. It's deeply confusing and oddly moving. Next to you, a baron mutters, "This one's always a crowd pleaser. Last week they did the storming of the Bastille." You raise an eyebrow. "With poodles?" He shrugs. Little wigs, tiny ladders. You had to be there. Eventually, the energy begins to settle. A few dogs curl up under the gaming tables, still wearing their little props. One falls asleep mid-costume change. You spot a sign near the door. Game suggestions welcomed. Please remember, no political themes after midnight. Good to know. It's easy to dismiss all this as pure fluff, literally and figuratively, but look closer and you'll see it's another layer of Versailles performance culture. Even playtime becomes a spectacle. Even a game of fetch is a chance to show off one's refinement, wit, and superior dog. And what you've learned tonight is this: the poodles aren't just pets. They're actors, they're artists, they're props and protagonists. And they've been trained not just to obey, but to delight. Still, part of you wonders how exactly one trains a dog to do this. It can't all be biscuits and applause. There must be more. There is more. But for that, you'll need to see what happens when the tea tray arrives. Because next up, napkins, posture, and the most dramatic sip in canine history. The gaming salon fades behind you in a soft echo of applause and distant yaps, and you follow a line of servants bearing trays. Silver ones, porcelain ones, even one shaped like a swan. Wherever they're headed, it smells faintly of bergamot, custard, and the kind of fear that only comes from trying to impress a duchess. And there it is, the tea salon. The room is paler than the rest of Versailles, almost translucent in its pastel splendor. The walls are painted with scenes of floating cherubs. The curtains flutter as if sighing. It feels like you've stepped into a cup of cream, and sitting inside that cup are dogs. Perfect, symmetrical poodles, each seated at a miniature table, facing forward like tiny lords and ladies. They are not barking. They are not scratching. They are, get this, waiting. You glance to your left and see a pair of servants in green livery setting napkins on each poodle's shoulders. Napkins, starched and monogrammed. A bell chimes softly. The signal. Tea service has begun. A footman appears beside you, and without blinking, mutters, "Please do not interfere with the ritual." You freeze, unsure whether he means the tea ritual or the entire dog cult you've stumbled into. You're witnessing the napkin drape ceremony. This is no small matter. In aristocratic circles, a well-timed napkin drape was the difference between a charming afternoon and social obliteration, and that applied to the dogs too. If your poodle fussed, barked, nudged the napkin off with its nose, that was it. Exile by gossip. The first napkin descends. A white poodle named Violette sits perfectly still. Her ears are curled like meringue. The servant places the cloth over her shoulders with a flourish, and she doesn't flinch. The crowd exhales. Somewhere, a powdered dowager actually claps, and thus, the ceremony continues. Napkin after napkin. Some poodles sigh with elegant boredom. Others lift their heads to assist the draping. One tries to lick the linen but stops after a discreet cough from his handler. Now you might be wondering, what's the point? Why teach a dog to sit at a table draped in linen and drink tea? Well, 2 reasons: performance and poise. Tea parties were power ballets. They weren't just about sipping and nibbling. They were about being watched doing so with grace. The presence of a properly trained poodle elevated the event from pleasant to legendary. And of course it helped if the dog could also sip. Yes, sip. Each poodle is given a tiny porcelain cup filled with a special broth, usually a cooled chamomile blend with a touch of duck essence. Don't worry, there's no actual caffeine. The goal isn't stimulation, it's elegance. You watch in disbelief as one after another, poodles are gently nudged toward their cups. A poodle named Moose sticks out her tongue and laps once, then twice. Then, oh no. She pauses, stares at her reflection, and gives a single disapproving bark. Gasps echo. The footman nods to a servant. Moose is wheeled away in a tiny chaise longue, visibly disappointed in herself. And then you spot him. A legendary standard poodle named Framboise. His coat is the color of fog, his posture perfect. They say he once drank tea in front of the Dauphine without blinking. He's the final performer tonight. The room stills. The napkin descends. He does not move. The cup is placed. He sniffs. Then, delicately, deliberately, he sips. Not too much, not too fast. And when he's done, he looks up at his handler and blinks twice. You hear someone whisper, "Poetry." Of course, not every poodle took to this level of theatrical civility. Historians still argue whether these dogs were genuinely calm or simply overtrained into submission. There's a diary entry from one noble who wrote, "My dear Eclair has taken to flinging his cup across the table when displeased with the steeping. I admire his principles, but fear the scandal." And yes, there was scandal. One infamous tea party in 1762 involved a rogue poodle who drank from every cup on the table before somersaulting into the quiche tray. The hostess was never seen in public again without gloves. No one knows why. But what made the napkin drape ceremony so powerful wasn't just the performance. It was the illusion of equality. For a brief, absurd moment, dog and noble were peers at the table. Both dignified, both sipping, both pretending this entire fantasy wasn't being held together by pâté and wishful thinking. You lean against a column and watch the scene. Tiny porcelain clinks, gentle slurps, a faint breeze from the windows. Somewhere, a harpsichord begins playing a lullaby. And maybe it's the soft lighting or the absurdity fatigue, but you start to think, this makes sense. If the world around you is built on spectacle, control, and etiquette, why wouldn't the dogs learn to play the same game? And play it? They do. But tea time is just the beginning. Because now that your dog can sit still in a waistcoat and politely refuse a biscuit, it's time for him to help in the kitchen. Yes, really? Because next, these aristocratic poodles are about to sniff truffles, judge soufflés, and become honorary sous chefs in wigs. The tea salon melts behind you like a particularly refined dream. Linen napkins fluttering in the air, poodles still blinking politely at half-empty teacups. But your journey through the poodle palaces of Versailles isn't slowing down. It's shifting to the kitchen. Yes, the kitchen. Now, don't get too excited. You're not going to be elbow deep in flour and duck fat. Not yet. This is Versailles, after all. No one does anything that messy unless they're paid handsomely and forbidden from using the front doors. But the dogs? Well, some of them have been promoted. The hall narrows as you descend into the cooler parts of the palace, where the ceilings are lower, the air smells of rosemary and rising cream, and the servants move fast. Everything here buzzes with quiet urgency, and yet, among the clatter and bustle of the royal kitchens, there are poodles, poised, focused, and absurdly clean. The first one you see is standing on a little wooden stool, nose twitching. A cook beside him is carefully unwrapping a cloth bundle. Inside, truffles. Because, of course, truffle sniffing was part of their job description. The poodle, a charcoal gray standard named Navette, leans in. One sniff, then a pause, then a paw placed squarely on the third truffle from the left. The cook grins. "That's the good one," he mutters. You're watching an aristocratic sous chef in action. Now, let's be clear. These dogs weren't hunting in the forests. That would be far too rustic. Instead, they were brought into the kitchens to validate ingredients. Their job was to signal quality, detect fakes, and in some cases, outsniff the hired help. One scandalous pamphlet from 1778 claimed that a royal cook was replaced because a duchess's poodle consistently disagreed with his seasoning. Historians still argue whether the poodles had truly trained noses or whether cooks simply pretended they did to flatter their employers. One diary from the period reads, "Daphne disliked the bechamel. We started over. I wept into the butter. But it wasn't just truffles. You move deeper into the kitchen and see a small arena has been formed. Velvet ropes, naturally, a few footstools, and 4 dogs seated in front of covered dishes. This is the dessert judging circle. A servant lifts the first lid, a tiny custard tart with a sugar rose. The first poodle sniffs and turns its head. Murmurs erupt. The second dish, a delicate almond millefeuille. The second dog gives a small, satisfied snort and taps a paw once. Cheers. You've stumbled into one of Versailles' best-kept secrets, dessert polishing. This was the practice of final tasting before any dish was deemed fit to be served at a noble table by poodles. They weren't eating entire portions, of course. That would be vulgar. But they were trained to sniff, inspect, and indicate approval or disapproval. A tail twitch meant too much lemon. A double snort, overcooked custard. And yes, this went so far as to alter menus. A famed cook once had to remove a chestnut mousse from an ambassador's luncheon because a duchess's poodle refused to sit in the room with it. You wander over to the spice rack where a small white poodle named Fleur is seated in front of 3 bowls. One has clove, one saffron, one something you can't quite place. Fleur dips her nose into each, then barks once at the saffron. The cook behind her nods as though she's just confirmed the Treaty of Versailles. This, apparently, is normal. And if you think this was all for show, think again. There are reports, lengthy ones, of noble families entering their poodles into competitive scent tournaments. Dogs were tasked with identifying flavor notes, locating smuggled ingredients, such as contraband cinnamon, and distinguishing between local and imported dairy. One noble even kept a flavor diary, documenting his poodle's preferences. In one entry, he noted, "Jasper seems to favor elderflower over violet today. This may affect the sorbet course." This was serious business. A poodle's palate became part of the household's identity. Their tastes shaped what was served, what was praised, and what was quietly pushed to the back of the larder. And while some cooks resented the furry food critics, others adapted. Recipes began including canine notes, gentler herbs, less garlic, more delicate aromatics. Some even created miniature tasting spoons for dogs, with gold leaf tips to avoid palate fatigue. You can't make this up. Well, you could, but someone already did, in the 1700s. Now you stand at the edge of the great oven hall, where an enormous sugar sculpture is being constructed for a visiting count. It's a full scene, a unicorn made of spun sugar rearing in front of a candied castle. And there, next to the base, a poodle sits, eyeing the sugar leaves. The cook notices your curiosity. "That's praline," she says, smiling. He guards the structure, barks if it begins to wilt. You glance again. Praline's expression is steely, protective, unbothered by the molten sugar nearby. And just when you think nothing could top this, a bell rings from the upper corridor. Dinner service is about to begin. The poodles rise. Because yes, they'll taste, they'll sniff, they'll even judge. But when it's time to eat, they're not in the kitchen anymore. They're in the royal salon, where silver bowls are polished, crystal water dishes are topped with rose ice, and chairs are pulled out by gloved hands. Because now, it's time to eat like royalty, literally. You don't follow the poodles up to the salon. Not yet. You're still lingering in the kitchen, where the scent of duck fat clings to the walls and the copper pans glint like medals of culinary honor. But the energy has shifted. The dogs are no longer just culinary assistants, they're dinner guests. And tonight, they dine like dukes. You make your way through the narrow service corridor, footsteps muffled by centuries of spilled wine and gossip. A servant, perhaps 14, perhaps 40, it's hard to tell, whispers, "You're going to want to see this." You emerge into the edge of the formal dining hall. First impression, gold. Gold everywhere. On the chairs, on the candlesticks, on the fingernails of the Marchioness of something or other, who just delicately sneezed into a silk handkerchief laced with violet perfume. And among it all, dogs. Dozens of immaculately groomed, smugly seated, suspiciously well-behaved poodles, each perched beside, or sometimes in, their own gilded chair. Some even have booster cushions. One wears a little velvet cravat. Another has a powdered wig, slightly askew. And yes, you heard right earlier. Some of them dine better than the humans. A footman walks past you, balancing a tray of duck consommé in bone china bowls. The scent curls into your nostrils. Thyme, bay, and a whisper of sherry. The bowls aren't for the nobles. They're for their poodles. Each poodle receives a ladled portion, their names whispered by staff like invocations. For Mademoiselle Bijou. For Lord Fluffington. Monsieur Tartelet's usual, hold the chervil. Historians still argue whether the palace chefs prepared two sets of meals, one for the people, one for the poodles, or whether the same kitchen churned out portions of haute cuisine in both human and canine formats. One memoir insists that a poodle's palate was a test run for the marquise's own plate. If the dog refused the veal, it was sent back. If the dog purred, or more accurately, licked its lips and wagged its tail, the dish was deemed worthy. Of course, the menu wasn't just meat. The poodle's courses often included vegetables drizzled in bone broth reduction, or barley pearls infused with rose essence. And dessert? Oh, dessert. Tiny lavender creme brulee in miniature ramekins. Apple slices fanned beside a whipped goat's cheese. Even iced marrow medallions molded into swans. One dog paws his crystal water bowl with annoyance. A butler instantly arrives to replace it, with a chilled version. The ice? Rosewater infused, filtered through linen, garnished with edible petals. There's a low murmur from the nobles, the sound of fans opening, gossip fluttering. You catch part of a sentence, and the Duchess still doesn't know that Marcel is allergic to pomegranate. Disaster at her last soiree. Another dog sneezes daintily. Everyone applauds. You wonder idly when exactly it became normal for these dogs to dine like kings. But it wasn't just Versailles. This was fashion. By the 1780s, across noble households in France, aristocrats weren't just dressing their pets. They were feeding them custom meals designed to complement their own. A baroness's memoir from 1784 mentions a carrot soufflé shared with my dearest Gustave, though he did leave half for the footman. Which raises the question, who's serving who here? A quirky detail from a recently translated kitchen inventory includes a list of dog-specific ingredients: duck confit, honeyed chestnuts, pressed apricot paste, and one mysterious item labeled pâté de lune. Scholars still debate what that even was. Possibly a cheese, possibly a joke. But here's what's clear. These dogs weren't pets. They were co-diners, attendees, honored guests. They had assigned seats, custom place cards, embroidered napkins, and if a noble guest dropped their spoon or, heaven forbid, asked for seconds before the dogs had finished, scandal. You turn toward the head of the table. There, flanked by two footmen and a string quartet playing something vaguely Vivaldi-esque, sits the Duchess of Belladone. On her right, her beloved poodle, Narcisse. He's wearing a ruffled bib and appears to be gnawing thoughtfully on a slow-roasted pigeon wing. The Duchess beams. He prefers his rare, she murmurs to her neighbor, who nods solemnly. One of the footmen trips ever so slightly while pouring wine for a marquis. No wine hits the floor, but a spoon rattles against a bowl. Instantly, Narcisse growls. Silence descends. The Duchess turns. "Do be careful," she says, not to the footman, but to the Marquis. "You startled him." The Marquis bows his head and mutters an apology. To the dog. Somewhere to your left, a maid brings in the next course, a beetroot tart, flanked with poached quail eggs and a sprig of sage. She sets it gently before a small white poodle wearing a single pearl earring. You blink. She blinks back. This is normal. What you're witnessing isn't a meal. It's a performance of status, of love, of obsession. And in this glittering absurdity, the dogs reign supreme. There's a final flourish. Silver domes lifted in unison. A chorus of gentle barking. The quartet shifts into a slow lullaby. The meal ends. The dogs are not ushered out. They remain seated as servants dab their paws with lemon water and retie ribbons that loosened during digestion. You turn away from the madness just in time to catch a young nobleman sneaking a leftover biscuit from his dog's plate. Shameful. Delicious. Tomorrow they'll all pretend none of this happened. But tonight? Tonight, the dogs dined better than anyone in France, and they'll do it again. The dining room is quiet now, save for the soft clink of silverware being collected and the rustle of servants tidying up after their four-legged guests. You step back into the corridor, dazed, mildly amused, and just a little hungry yourself. But as you pass through the palace again, you begin to notice something else. Resentment. You catch it first in a whisper. Two chambermaids in the shadows of a candelabra alcove, speaking fast and low. She's got Florette sleeping on silk cushions again. In the blue room? Yes, that's her favorite room. The Duchess hasn't slept there in weeks. Said it smelled too much like biscuits. A pause. Then a snort of laughter. The dogs of Versailles may be spoiled, perfumed, and absurdly dignified, but not everyone's thrilled about it. Downstairs, in the servant quarters, eyes roll and eyebrows lift. The staff who trim the poodle's nails by candlelight or brush out their ears with tiny ivory combs often have straw pallets and cold stew for their own supper. One footman reportedly muttered, "I'd trade my boots for the Duke's dog's bed. At least his sheets are warmed." And warmed they were, literally. Some poodles had copper bed warmers slid beneath their mattresses on cold nights. Meanwhile, kitchen scullions huddled near stoves, brushing off ash and aristocratic indifference. Historically, it's not hard to track this tension. The late 18th century saw an ever-growing divide between noble luxury and working-class drudgery. Poodles, those darling little symbols of joy and wealth, became walking, barking, perfumed reminders of inequality. Historians still argue whether the poodles were direct sources of resentment or merely symbols of a broader rot. Either way, the message was clear. When a duchess's dog has its own carriage and your cousin sleeps in the barn, something is profoundly wrong. Yes, some of the poodles had private carriages. Tiny, open-top buggies pulled by miniature ponies, or, in one documented case, 4 identically groomed goats. A child's job, if they were lucky enough to be born into minor nobility, was sometimes to escort the family poodle through the gardens like a prince. There's even a record from a 1778 servant's journal of a dog named Biscuits being late to a tea party on account of hoof fatigue. The goats, you see, required rest. And when they weren't being paraded around like velvet-wrapped miracles, they were massaged. Yes, weekly oil massages. You watch in a side chamber as a tired valet rubs almond oil into the paws of a particularly fluffy white poodle named Etiquette. The dog sighs in bliss. Nearby, the valet's own shoes are splitting at the seams. Quirky side note, at least one salon owner in Paris became famous for his dog spa room service, which offered rose petal paw soaks, fur-smoothing lavender masks, and calming harp music. A few nobles even requested appointment slots for themselves, only to be told the poodles took priority. It's around this time, as you wander through the halls of dogdom excess, that you stumble upon the strangest little drama of all. The poodle heir. In the house of Count Mirabeau, one of Versailles' more flamboyant figures, there was a legal battle over inheritance. Not for a title, not for land, for a dog. The Count's will reportedly included a clause: let Celestine, his poodle, retain the yellow drawing room, her favorite silk throw, and a stipend of 120 livres per annum for her maintenance, administered by Madame Dupont, with whom she shares an affection. A stipend. For a dog. The servants? Not mentioned. And, oh, the murmurs this sparked. One maid allegedly threw a velvet slipper across the corridor. Another refused to serve at tea unless Celestine was kept away from the pastries. Eventually, the matter was settled. Celestine retired to a countryside estate with Madame Dupont. The staff sighed, some in relief, some in fury. But the message was clear. If you wanted love, security, and comfort in aristocratic France, it helped to be fluffy. Of course, not all poodles inspired resentment. Some were adored by the staff. secret treats slipped under tables, nighttime snuggles when the mistress wasn't looking. A young stable boy once wrote a letter describing his only friend in Versailles, a poodle who slept at the stables when she grew tired of court life. But still, the divide deepened. One scullery maid described it best in a note found decades later under a floorboard. "We shine their silver, we press their lace, and we curtsy to their dogs. I pray for fleas." A cheeky little wish, and one that probably came true. Even these royal creatures weren't immune to nature. Despite their manicured fur and perfumed coats, the occasional flea outbreak would throw a salon into chaos. Anti-flea powders, some made of ground pearls and vinegar, were sprinkled like magical dust. If a dog scratched too much, they were whisked away for quarantine in a side parlor, attended by 2 servants and a physician's apprentice. It's absurd, you think, how far the pendulum had swung. Poodles were no longer animals, they were avatars, extensions of aristocratic identity. To insult the dog was to insult the Duchess. To mishandle a paw was to risk demotion, or worse, exile to the wine cellars. And yet, even in all this extravagance, there were cracks. At the edge of the garden one day, you spot a groundskeeper staring at a passing poodle parade. His rake is still, his eyes hard. One of the dogs, draped in silk, glances back with vague indifference. A gust of wind lifts the leaves, stirs the feathers on a dog's hat. Something's coming. But for now, in the final calm before the storm, the poodles bask in glory. Massaged, perfumed, escorted, and occasionally hated. And through it all, they remain blissfully unaware. Or are they? You're drifting now, just a little, lulled by the lullabies of clinking porcelain and perfumed paw massages. But don't close your eyes yet, because just as the sun rises over 1,000 ruffled dog bonnets, a storm brews in the daintiest of teacups. It starts, as many great scandals do, with a biscuit. A lemon biscuit, to be precise, lightly sugared, delicately crisp, and topped with a glazed curl of candied violet. The sort of biscuit that took 3 pastry chefs, 2 hours and 4 arguments to perfect. The kind of biscuit no human ever got to taste warm. And on the afternoon of March 3rd, 1764, one such biscuit flew across a salon at alarming speed. You're in the thick of it now, seated discreetly on a velvet settee in Madame de Villeneuve's ornate tea room. The event? Her weekly scandalous, dog of the hour salon, where noble guests bring their most obedient, most fashionable poodles to sip broth and show off new tricks. Everything is going as usual. Powdered noses, polite yawns, small gasps of envy over bejeweled collars. You sip pretend tea from a cup meant for dogs. It's beef-flavored. Then you hear it. A shriek. A tray clatters. A bark ricochets off the mirror-paneled walls. And in slow motion, a lemon biscuit, gilded edge glinting like a missile, arcs through the air and lands squarely on the wig of Viscountess d'Orléans. Gasps. Frozen spoons. One gentleman faints, possibly out of habit. The culprit? A small, trembling poodle named Crumpet. Crumpet, until now, had been the darling of the salon circuit, a caramel-colored fluff with impeccable paw posture and a bow made of imported Venetian lace. But Crumpet had snapped. Accounts vary. Some say the dog was startled by a nearby servant sneezing. Others whisper he had been improperly powdered that morning and was emotionally off balance. One brave insider suggests he was simply tired of broth. Regardless, Crumpet's paw struck the tea tray, and the lemon biscuit went flying. That would have been the end of it, a funny tale for the week's gossip had the Viscountess not declared, hand to forehead, "This is an affront to God and society." The room turned icy. A duel was declared, not by Crumpet, he was immediately scooped up and spirited away, but by his owner, the Marquis de Laverne, a man who believed in honor, powdered vests, and very strongly in lemon biscuits. The duel, as duels go, was swift and stupid. Pistols at dawn over a flying treat. Both men missed their shots. One fainted, again, likely habitual, and the other declared, "Let us never speak of this." But it was too late. The scandal was out. For days, salons buzzed. Some claimed Crumpet had been possessed. Others blamed poor breeding, improper tea etiquette training, or, most outrageously, the rise of sugar in canine diets. Historians still argue whether the biscuit incident marked the beginning of Versailles' obsession, tipping into parody. Some say it was the moment when even the nobility realized they had gone too far. Others claim it was just another Tuesday. Whatever the truth, what followed was a bizarre cascade of overcorrection. Within a week, the official guide to poodle conduct at tea was expanded to include a new chapter on sudden movements and the handling of emotive confections. Within 2, lemon biscuits were banned entirely from dog salons, declared a risk to decorum and dueling etiquette. And within a month, a new training academy was launched just outside Paris, dedicated to canine stoicism and table restraint. You visit briefly. It's grim. The dogs wear tiny waistcoats and stare solemnly at trays of untouched pastries. One whimpers. No one moves. Of course, the ban on lemon biscuits sparked its own backlash. Smugglers emerged. Ladies with hidden compartments in their skirts began sneaking biscuits into salons like contraband. One noblewoman was caught offering her poodle a lemon drop beneath a lace handkerchief. A scandal. She was quietly exiled to her countryside manor for 2 months, allegedly for reflection and chamomile. This was, after all, pre-revolutionary France. Appearances mattered more than reality, and nothing could be more ruinous than a dog caught mid-munch. But while the court gossiped and the poodles were retrained to avoid citrus-based violence, deeper cracks were beginning to show. You overhear it in hushed tones. If a biscuit can start a duel, what might an insult do? Why do the dogs eat better than the staff? Have we lost our minds? A lady's maid, barely old enough to lace her own corset, sighs as she cleans biscuit crumbs from a velvet chaise. "They'll serve foie gras to dogs," she mutters, "and send us to war with bread crusts." And yet, back in the salons, things return, on the surface, to normal. Crumpet is never seen again in public. Rumors swirl. Retired to the countryside, exiled to an English duchess, or living in anonymous comfort in Lyon under the name Monsieur Fluff? No one knows for sure. But you do hear one whispered theory, passed from parlor to parlor, like a forbidden bedtime story, that Crumpet, disgraced but dignified, now hosts his own secret tea parties. Deep in a hidden chamber beneath Versailles, only dogs allowed. You chuckle softly as you leave the salon, the scent of lemon and powdered sugar lingering in your nose. Out in the gardens, a gardener scowls at a poodle wearing a feathered cap. Somewhere, a biscuit tray trembles. The gardens of Versailles stretch before you in immaculate patterns, perfect hedges, fountains gurgling politely, and marble statues that look mildly unimpressed with everything. But today, the usual elegance is upstaged. There's a runway in the orangery, and not just any runway. This one is for dogs. You find yourself seated beside the Duchesse de Clermont, who has not smiled since 1742, sipping chilled lavender syrup from a crystal flute. She gestures vaguely toward the stage with a lace-gloved hand and sighs, "The spring canine collection. Let's hope no one wears velvet again. It's so last year." That's right. You're at Versailles Fashion Week. Poodles on Parade Edition. As the harpists begin their sleepy overture, the first model trots out. It's a poodle, obviously. He's wearing a ruffled cravat, a tiny tailcoat made of green satin embroidered with scenes from the Aeneid, and a feathered tricorn hat perched between his carefully puffed ears. The crowd murmurs its approval. One marquis clutches his heart. You glance to your left. Someone is sketching the look frantically onto a fan. To your right, a countess whispers, "It's the embroidery." That's how you show legacy without looking nouveau. Each poodle is accompanied down the runway by a silent handler dressed in black, whose job is to vanish into the background while ensuring no paws step off the carpet. If a poodle strays, gasps ripple through the audience as though someone has set fire to the Treaty of Utrecht. The fashion itself is outrageous. One poodle wears an organza gown with a pearl-draped bustle. Another is styled as an 18th century naval officer, complete with a teeny telescope strapped to his back. Then there's the garden muse look, an elaborate confection of fake ivy, flower rosettes, and a bonnet sprouting actual lavender stems. The dog sneezes once and is immediately escorted off stage. Allergy protocols are strict. Behind all this pageantry lies a serious business. Dog couture houses, yes, actual fashion ateliers, have cropped up across Paris, employing human seamstresses to hand-stitch outfits for the upper crust's four-legged companions. The most famous, Maison Pouf, claims to have received letters from the Queen herself. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette ever commissioned a gown for her spaniel, but it's clear her poodle, Muscade, wore shoes more expensive than most people's rent. And this isn't just for show. At these events, nobles place wagers, form alliances, and subtly showcase their status through canine fashion. The more original the design, the more whispers of admiration. The richer the embroidery, the deeper the envy. But competition can get strange. In one memorable year, a baron's wife entered her poodle, entirely shaved, and painted with an elaborate pastoral scene. The paint was egg tempera and lemon dye. The dog, named Rousseau, licked off part of a tree, mid-parade. A scandal. Art or madness? The debate raged for weeks. Another year, a duchess insisted on dressing her poodle as a metaphor for the Enlightenment. The costume involved a tiny book, a candle hat, and a smug expression that was frankly uncanny. And once, just once, someone tried to pass off a non-poodle, a perfumed spaniel named Claude, wearing a curly wig. He was politely escorted out by 3 footmen and a large, disapproving pug. As you sit beneath the golden sun filtering through the orangery's glass dome, it becomes clear. Fashion isn't the goal. Control is. These dogs are symbols of wealth, of taste, of absolute mastery over the natural world. They've been powdered, perfumed, painted, trained, and dressed until their very bark sounds aristocratic. One noble even claimed his poodle could yawn in iambic pentameter. There's a small intermission, during which bored duchesses trade pastel macarons and compare their dogs' tail fluff ratios. You overhear one lament, "I do adore Pompon's chin ruff, but lately she's been shedding like a commoner." Another replies, "You must try the sea silk supplements, harvested from Mediterranean clams. Very exclusive. The next round begins. This one is themed Poodles of Antiquity. You watch a procession of dogs styled as ancient Greek philosophers. One wears a laurel crown and appears to be deep in thought. Another is swaddled like a baby Achilles, complete with a tiny golden heel guard. But the highlight is Caesar, a poodle in a Roman general's toga with a tiny scroll clutched in his jaws. When he reaches the end of the runway, he unfurls the scroll with his paw. The audience erupts into applause. The scroll reads, Veni, Vidi, Woofy. A duchess weeps softly. Still, not all is serene beneath the sequins. Servants hover at the edges, whispering behind fans. You catch fragments, grumblings about silk waist, hours spent ironing paw pleats. One girl furious her mistress's dog gets more embroidery than her wedding dress. And somewhere, deeper in the palace, a steward mutters, "These dogs are dressed for war while the nation starves." But outside, beneath the chiming harps and fluttering parasols, the show goes on. By late afternoon, the winning poodle is crowned. Bébé Henri, dressed as the Sun King himself, complete with a replica throne, a golden cape, and a powdered wig taller than the dog itself. He barks once. The crowd gasps in delight. The prize? A month's supply of goose liver bonbons and a commissioned portrait by the court's official animal painter. You pass by the portrait studio on your way out. Inside, a cocker spaniel sits dramatically on a chaise longue while a man in breeches paints with absurd seriousness. "More nobility in the eyes," he mutters. "Less canine." As twilight sets in, the orangery clears. Velvet scraps flutter to the floor. A forgotten wig floats in the fountain. A poodle in rhinestone booties licks whipped cream from a silver spoon while her handler pretends not to cry. You sigh. It's been a long day of fashion, foolishness, and fur. But oh, what a show. You're standing beside a dining table so long, it practically vanishes into the Versailles haze, where chandeliers dangle like frozen waterfalls, and even the napkins have gold-threaded edges. But this isn't dinner for people. This is a banquet for poodles. And not just any banquet. This is the highly exclusive, absurdly opulent, occasionally whispered about Chien Superior Supper Club, where the dogs of the French elite dine like emperors, and where humans, yes, must sometimes wait their turn. You spot the Marquis de Lavoisier's prized poodle, Fifi, delicately licking lavender creme brulee from a porcelain ramekin. She pauses only to dab her mouth. No, really, with a monogrammed linen napkin tied gently around her neck like a bib. Her handler hovers just out of frame, nervously holding a fan in case a breeze dares to muss Fifi's ear fluff. And the menu? Forget dry biscuits. Tonight's offerings include duck consommé, poached salmon with fennel mousse, and roasted quail legs served in tiny silver bowls. No garlic, naturally, as the dogs are on sensitive palates, according to their chefs. Yes, plural. There's a kitchen staff just for the poodles. These dog chefs wear pristine aprons and whisper in a conspiratorial hush. You hear one say, "Did you see the way Pompon turned away from the pigeon pâté yesterday? Like we were feeding her peasant crumbs." The entire system runs like clockwork. Silver bells ring, paw-sized plates appear, and little stools help the dogs climb into their velvet-cushioned chairs. No barking is permitted. That's rule number 1. Codified in the secret dog club bylaws. Rule number 2. No sniffing each other mid-course. A discreet pamphlet you manage to peek at reveals the rest. No drinking from others' goblets. One polite paw raise if needing more gravy. Absolutely no table begging, only eye contact. Historians still argue whether these etiquette rules were more strictly enforced than those at the royal table. And the sad truth? They probably were. Now, you may be wondering how this madness began. It all started, they say, with an ambitious duchess and a truffle. The tale goes that in 1753, the Duchesse d'Argenson, overcome with affection for her miniature poodle Jacques, insisted the royal chefs create a truffle-infused chicken mousse just for him. When Jacques ate it and yawned in delight, the guests applauded. A tradition was born. Soon, noble households were outdoing each other, sourcing Sardinian sea salt, importing North African saffron, hiring chefs from Venice who specialized in duck confit for pets. Some even constructed custom cutlery, gold forks with paw-shaped handles, knives engraved with dog names like Lulu and Margot. And yes, the poodles dined before their owners. Let the dogs eat first was not a mark of humility. It was a status move. Proof you had so many resources, even your poodle could reject creme fraiche and nobody would blink. You watch as one waiter pours distilled spring water into crystal bowls, chilled with ice cubes carved into fleur-de-lis. Another layers goose terrine between curls of potato lace, presenting it like a miniature wedding cake. A third, panicked, drops a duck tartlet. The room freezes. The poodle at the table, an elderly gentleman named Comte Chiffon, sniffs the air, looks unimpressed, and turns his head slowly away. No second chances. The tartlet is swept away. The waiter bows in apology to the dog. At the far end of the table, the Baroness de Lestrac's dog, a fluff ball named Mamiette, wears a diamond-encrusted collar and has her own custom taster. Yes, really. A young maid whose sole job is to test every bite for temperature and taste. You overhear the maid murmur, "Too much sage," before being promptly dismissed. Mamiette receives a revised tart with just a hint of thyme. Her tail gives one dignified wag. Now and then, the human guests sneak nibbles of their dogs' plates. Just to check the seasoning, they whisper guiltily. One man is caught with a spoonful of pâté and is shamed with a single raised eyebrow from a butler. Not all is calm beneath the foie gras. Servants grumble in the wings. This whole event takes hours, and many haven't eaten all day. You hear someone mutter, "Last week I licked bechamel off a poodle's whiskers. I used to study law." And there's brewing unrest among the noble guests as well. "My invitation was for 7, one hisses. "It's now nearly 10, and I've not had so much as a bread roll." "Shh," her neighbor says. "Look at how Plume is chewing." Plume, a toy poodle with golden anklets, is delicately dismantling a pheasant wing, one refined tooth at a time. The whole scene feels like a hallucination. Even Voltaire is rumored to have once attended one of these feasts, purely for the spectacle, of course. He later quipped, according to some unverified accounts, "In France, it is only dogs who live like kings. The rest of us merely bark politely." Somewhere near the end of the meal, dessert is served. Each poodle receives a chilled sorbet, rosewater for girls, orange blossom for boys, shaped like a tiny bust of Louis XV. One licks the nose off, gasps all around. Candied violets and hand-folded biscuit fans round out the service, though one rebellious spaniel throws his fan on the floor in protest. The scandal rocks the room for a good 20 minutes. Finally, the human guests are permitted to sit. Their food? A bit tepid, frankly. Some of the sauces are slightly congealed. The seating arrangements are chaotic. You're stuck beside a viscount who's arguing with his dog over a spilled wine glass. The dog appears to be winning. push around a spoonful of overcooked duck, wondering if the Poodles will be raiding you now. As the candles burn lower and the room is filled with the quiet hum of satisfied barks and exhausted nobles, you notice something odd. Despite the extravagance, there's a strange emptiness to it all. The laughter feels forced, the opulence brittle. And the dogs? They're full, certainly, but not particularly joyful. You'd almost swear one of them sighs. Or maybe that was you. Somewhere near the gilded edge of your exhaustion, you find yourself drifting not into sleep, but into an opera box. Well, not just any opera box. This one belongs to a pearl-collared poodle named Bijou, whose bark is softer than silk, and whose fan, yes, she has a fan, is perfumed with bergamot and embroidered with tiny scenes of court gossip. You sit beside her now, in a red velvet seat fluffed to perfection, as the orchestra swells and the curtain lifts. But Bijou isn't watching the show. She's watching the crowd. You begin to understand. For some dogs, the stage was never down below. It was up here, in the balconies where elite lapdogs held court in miniature opera salons. Historians still argue whether Poodles truly held preferred seating at Parisian operas, or whether this was simply an exaggeration of their noble owner's vanity. But the evidence is fluffy. Diaries from the 1770s describe lapdogs in couture, swaddled in fur-lined carriers, nestled against powdered décolletage, munching on almond cakes during intermission. One pamphlet from the time refers to a Madame Canine who howled through an entire area and was only silenced by a sugared prune. You feel the thrum of music beneath your feet as Bijou daintily shifts, her tiny shoes, yes, shoes, clicking against the padded bench. Her handler stands behind her like a royal bodyguard, holding a bottle of rose water and a very tiny parasol in case the chandelier's reflection is too harsh for her eyes. Tonight's show? Orphée aux Enfers. But the dogs aren't here for Orpheus. They're here to be seen. It's Lapdog Society's equivalent of the Met Gala. Every pair of eyes glances from box to box, poodle to pug, mastiff to Maltese. Who's wearing whom? Has Madame Lavanne's Shih Tzu lost weight? Is that actual lace on Biscuits' ears? You shift your gaze downward, where humans jostle for second-tier seats, while the dogs sip gently from porcelain cups of lukewarm chamomile. They aren't expected to stay silent. Of course not. A well-timed yawn is practically a review. Suddenly, there's a stir. An enormous greyhound in full brocade enters the far box, escorted by two powdered footmen, and the crowd murmurs. You hear whispers, "That's the prince's dog," the one that winked at Rousseau. Beside you, Bijou bristles slightly. This isn't jealousy. It's politics. You lean back as her maid gently mists her ears with lavender. It's almost enough to lull you, but then you notice the theater program. It's been printed with paw notes. Tiny symbols indicate which scenes may distress more sensitive pets, particularly those with loud violins or sudden key changes. There are even scratch and sniff margins, rose for romantic arias, citrus for comedic duets. You're handed a pair of opera glasses, miniature, of course, for lapdog-sized faces, and notice some dogs actually use them, trained to perch them upon their snouts like tired aristocrats, sighing at flat notes. You spot one poodle napping soundly, her bonnet slipping gently over her eyes. She's seen this opera before, twice. Meanwhile, her mistress watches the dog, not the stage, as though the real performance is unfolding one paw shift at a time. And then there's the intermission, which is less of a break and more of a fashion parade. Handlers carry their dogs down into the salons, where petit fours and beef broth cubes await. Some dogs switch outfits. Ribbons are fluffed, wigs adjusted, cloaks with golden tassels swapped for pearl-stitched shawls. One daring pup even debuts a velvet turban, a scandalous choice. There are whispers of influence from Ottoman court trends. A fringe detail. In 1772, the Duchesse de Boufflers apparently launched a lapdog opera league where poodles were scored by other nobles for attentiveness and poise throughout a performance. Bijou, according to surviving notes, received a perfect 10 for remaining awake during a 3-hour monologue on fate. But all this pomp wasn't just vanity. No, this was aristocratic dog ownership elevated to the realm of theater diplomacy. Seating proximity mattered. Shared boxes implied alliances. A dog invited to share a viewing blanket? That was practically betrothal. Some historians believe the elaborate seating charts at these performances directly mirrored Versailles' own power grid. If your poodle was demoted to row 4, that meant you had fallen out of favor. And if your lapdog was seen sniffing an ambassador's dachshund too long, whispers of espionage might follow. But it wasn't all choreographed. One infamous night, a bored poodle named Truth leapt from her box seat in mid-cavatina, landed on a violinist's head, and bolted across the orchestra pit, trailing lace. She reportedly made it to the Queen's slippers before collapsing in dramatic exhaustion. The Queen, amused, fed her candied violets. The violinist was less amused. You blink slowly as the third act begins. The lights dim, the overture swells again. Dogs stretch gently, some leaning their heads against scented cushions, others curling beside tiny foot warmers. The air hums with incense and anticipation. And then, a long, sweet silence. One dog snores, another sighs. You feel your eyes flutter. Something about the soft rustle of silk, the warm lull of orchestral strings, and the weight of shared absurdity washes over you like warm milk. Even Bijou leans against your shoulder now. The opera carries on, but here in the velvet shadows, you begin to forget which world is more surreal, the one on stage or the one beside you. You let yourself drift. You're not sure what wakes you. The rustle of silk, the whisper of hooves, or the sharp scent of smoke curling faintly through the air. You open your eyes to find the gilding has dulled. The opera boxes are quiet now, many of them empty. Bijou is gone. So are the footmen, the violinists, the little porcelain teacups and biscuit trays. Only a breeze stirs the tattered edge of a curtain, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. You are no longer in the powdered fantasy of royal Paris. You are in 1789. The Poodles are in danger. Historians still argue whether the revolutionary mobs truly targeted dogs as symbols of elite decadence, or whether the tales of guillotined greyhounds and smuggled spaniels are just exaggerated parables of class warfare. But what's undeniable is this. As the chandeliers of Versailles dimmed and the streets of Paris began to roar, the days of dog opera boxes and duck consommé tea services came to a very sudden, very frightened end. You walk quietly now, through the back alleys of a once lavish district. A servant hurries past, clutching a bundle wrapped in tattered linen. You hear a soft whimper from inside. It's a puppy. She glances over her shoulder, then disappears into the mist. Rumors swirl faster than smoke. Dogs tossed into the Seine, kennels burned, once proud poodles shaved to escape notice. Carriages once lined with silk are overturned and splattered with mud. A duchess tries to board a boat disguised as a milkmaid, with 3 terrified poodles in her apron. only one makes it. In one haunting letter from 1792, a noblewoman describes sewing diamonds into the hem of her dog's travel blanket before fleeing to the countryside. "If I am taken," she writes, "perhaps Bijou may still live in luxury somewhere. Far from this." Others weren't so lucky. You stumble across a courtyard littered with broken teacups. The silver food bowls are still there, but empty. One has a name engraved, Fifi. Nearby lies a single velvet slipper, paw-sized, embroidered with a crown. A symbol of a world that, quite literally, went to the dogs. Yet even here, amid fear and flight, the love didn't die. One fringe pamphlet from the Revolution warns citizens to watch the dogs. They carry messages. Some historians believe nobles used their pampered pets to smuggle letters, jewels, and even coded warnings between safe houses. A Maltese named Citron was reportedly caught with a lace collar stitched with a royalist map. Though this may be apocryphal, it tells you everything about how deeply dogs were woven into the fabric of this strange, crumbling society. And then, of course, there were the loyalists, the staff, the old maids who stayed behind to care for the animals long after the nobility had fled or fallen. You glimpse one now, a hunched figure in a dusty apron feeding scraps to a limping spaniel in what used to be a garden. The roses are gone, the fountains are cracked, but the dog still wags her tail. Not all poodles vanished into tragedy. Some were adopted by revolutionary families, albeit shorn, renamed, stripped of their powdered ribbons. No more Marquise Chérie or Petit Roi. Now they were Courage or Citoyenne. A few dogs adapted, becoming symbols of endurance. Others simply became pets again, no longer opera critics or truffle sommeliers, but companions, warm and snoring at the foot of a much plainer bed. But one story stays with you. It's whispered by the last surviving butler of a Parisian duke, who claims that, during the storming of the Bastille, his master's poodle escaped, in full costume, and was last seen trotting down the Rue Saint-Antoine, holding a sugared biscuit in her mouth, utterly unbothered. Was it a dream? A final act of poodle defiance? Historians are still unsure. You wander farther now, through a world both newer and sadder. The music halls are quiet, the mirrors are cracked, but somewhere, a paw print remains in dried wax on an abandoned ballroom floor. A ghost of a giggle catches on the breeze, and for a moment, you almost hear the faint jingle of jeweled collars. Maybe they're still out there, in stories, in dreams, waiting patiently for their next cue, their next saucer of cream, their next absurd little tea party. You pass one final sign tacked to a crumbling wall. For sale, small silver fork, suitable for poodle, slight burn on handle, will trade for bread. And somehow, that says it all. You take a deep breath now, and the air is gentler. No more powdered chaos, no more political whispers, just you, wandering through a quiet patch of countryside, somewhere far from the palace gates. A soft wind nudges the tall grass aside, and you follow an old garden path where the stones are cracked, but still remember footsteps. Somewhere, a poodle is retired. Her name is Clementine. She once attended tea parties in satin booties. She bowed for archduchesses and lapped rosewater from crystal. She danced a minuet wearing feathers taller than her ears, and once, only once, was fed by a duke himself, who whispered a secret recipe for macarons as he stroked her freshly pomaded ears. But all of that is behind her now. You find her on a small farm where the lavender grows in wild, disobedient waves. No more gilded brushes or mahogany paw stools. Now, her mornings are spent sunbathing by the window and gently barking at chickens she doesn't intend to chase. Her new owners are kind, a widow, and her 2 young grandchildren who don't know the difference between a duchess and a doorknob. They call her Clemmy. She doesn't mind. Sometimes Clemmy dreams. She twitches in her sleep, legs kicking out as if leaping across ballroom floors. A tiny bark slips out when she remembers the applause after her biscuit balancing routine. On cool afternoons, she paws at the garden gate, perhaps waiting for a carriage that no longer exists. The family humors her. They clip her fur with a kitchen scissor and occasionally place an old lace curtain over her back like a cape. "Lady Clemmy," the girl whispers, serving a thimbleful of warm milk in a porcelain shot glass salvaged from a flea market. And for a moment, just a flicker of a moment, Clemmy straightens her spine like she used to. Tail lifted, chin proud. Old habits die very, very hard. But mostly, Clemmy's days are simple now. She naps in sunbeams, listens to crickets, and rolls in the dirt with absolute scandalous joy. The elegant stride has become a dignified hobble, and her coat, once maintained by royal appointment, now hosts the occasional dandelion fluff. You sit beside her in the grass, and she leans her soft, graying head against your leg. You scratch behind her ear in just the right spot. Yes, that one. And she lets out a sigh so content, so bone-deep relieved, that you wonder if she remembers any of it at all, or if she cares. Historians still argue whether dogs like Clementine ever understood their roles as symbols of a doomed world, or whether they were just innocent bystanders in a glittering farce. Some say they were used, like fans and fountains and gold leaf pastries. Others argue they were adored, not as fashion, but as family. Clemmy doesn't say. Instead, she watches the sun fade behind the trees, paws tucked neatly beneath her. A beetle crawls across a flat stone. The lavender sways. You get the distinct feeling that she's waiting for something. And then it comes. The little girl appears again, cradling a chipped teacup and an old cookie tin. She kneels in the grass and sets up a lopsided tea party. A plastic spoon for stirring, a cracked saucer for the imaginary sugar cubes. And Clementine, Lady Clemmy, former toast of Versailles, sits up. Slowly, proudly, as if all the salons of Paris were watching once more. She waits for her turn, then delicately noses the saucer. The girl giggles. The game continues. No audience, no opera box, no powdered wigs. Just a little girl, a poodle, and a memory that smells faintly of rose water and cream. In the distance, someone rings a dinner bell. Clemmy's tail thumps once. She's earned her rest. And now, you drift. The party has ended. The lace has loosened. The powdered wigs have all gone to sleep in their little hat boxes, and the chandeliers flicker one last time before settling into darkness. You close your eyes, but your mind still floats through corridors of velvet and rose-scented ribbons. The sound of gentle paws on marble lingers faintly in the air, like distant rain tapping on old windows. Clementine is resting now. So are you. Out there, in the soft folds of history, the absurd still hums quietly, like a forgotten lullaby of dogs in brocade, of aristocrats whispering secrets into floppy ears, of servants adjusting velvet cushions for animals who didn't know or care that they lived more luxuriously than most humans ever would. The Poodles are sleeping now, and so should you. Let the lights dim further. Let your thoughts unravel, slow and soft, like satin ribbons falling from a too tight corset. There's no need to worry if it all truly happened, if they really had napkin-draped ceremonies and diamond-studded collars. What matters is that, for a little while, you wandered there. And now, with the moon brushing lightly against the edge of your window and that comforting hush beginning to settle behind your eyes, it's time to let go. No carriages, no footmen, no royal commands, just breath and stillness and the quiet companionship of dreams. May you sleep with the peace of a well-fed poodle, retired from duty, stretched out beneath a patch of lavender sky. Good night, dear listener.